Okay, I trust that you can see the presentation now. So we'll go right into it. So for the presentation, we'll have a brief introduction, and then we'll look at the overview of data privacy laws. Of course, we have a framework that exists, because whatever culture we have needs to take into account what the framework, the legal framework demands, and make sure that our strategies are aligned with the law. And then we'll look at some strategies for fostering a data privacy culture, and then we'll look at the questions and hopefully complements and supplements to what I've discussed, because I know that each organization has its own internal requirements, but also experiences, which I hope that we shall be able to share and develop together strategies that will be foolproof for the near future and the time ahead, because the data by its nature is evolving. So the privacy programs and whatever we do around culture needs to be evolving as fast as the data and the environment in which we operate is evolving. So first off, we'll ask, what is data privacy culture and why is it important? So it's been defined and categorized by different authors and experts, but overall, data privacy is that relationship between the collection and dissemination of data, the technology, then the public expectation of privacy. It also looks at the contextual norms in which information is held, and then the legal and political issues surrounding them. So it's a holistic view of what it takes between collecting, use, and then dissemination of data, as well as what other legal and political issues surround that collection and use. So data privacy culture overall refers to that collective attitude that we have, the values and behaviors within an organization or society regarding the protection of personal privacy and also data. So what does it mean? How do you handle the data that you have, and what's your perception? What are the emotions, attitudes that your organization has concerning the data that you hold? Is it taken seriously? Is it held with the respect that it deserves? So that is what forms privacy culture, and what you are known about and how you handle data is what is known as your culture. So it could be good or it could be bad. And so the discussion this morning aims to make sure that our privacy culture is addressed in terms of what do we have in existence today and what do we want to change about it, what can we do better to have a better view of ourselves, but also the people looking in have a better view of how we handle data, but also it's an approved view in terms of acknowledgement and standard practices that are held by the majority of people that we handle data for. Then personal data, which is also defined under our acts in Uganda, but also generally under several laws that apply to Uganda, like the GDPR. Personal data is that information about a person from which that person can be identified and that is recorded in any form. So we're going to be talking about both the physical data, the electronic data, as well as the new forms of data that we have seen evolving in the technology era. And so data, personal data itself can take any form. And that's something we need to know as we go along. So why is data privacy important? Why is it important to have a data privacy culture? So data privacy is not only a legal obligation, it is actually an important business imperative, which, if mishandled, can potentially damage a business to the core and lead to interruption to your operations, but also other consequences. But more than that, it's important to know that data privacy is actually a human right that is enshrined in several laws, as well as our own constitution and local data privacy act. So we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That was the document, sort of the cardinal origin of this right, which recognized the right to privacy under Article 12. And it basically looks at the right to protection from arbitrary interference with one's privacy, as well as one's home, correspondence, family. It's a wide definition of data privacy. So when we come close to home, what constitutes personal data is a broad definition of what information do we hold, which could potentially interrupt or interfere with one's privacy, family, home, or correspondence. So that full scope needs to be held in protecting privacy. The other important reason why we need to mind the culture that we have concerning personal data is the brand and business potential growth that comes from a good privacy culture. So if you're known for having standards and for protecting personal data, most likely you will have the goodwill, the trust, as well as a good reputation, which will solicit more information. And we all know that our customers, our clients will trust us with information to the extent that they are aware of our protection mechanisms, as well as the transparency with which we handle their data. So the potential business growth and reputational gains are really, really high. And so it's important that we have a good culture as well as a good reputation. The other angle to look at it from is the potential loss that we could face as organizations for having a poor data privacy culture. Naturally, if there's a poor culture, there will be breaches, which will potentially lead to fines as well as criminal liability should a complaint come through for which we are held liable. So the fines that we could face could potentially damage our productivity, our profitability, and so it's important that we develop the right data privacy culture and mechanisms. So looking at the laws that we have in place, a high level mentioned, we have the Constitution of Uganda, which enshrines the article relating to the right to privacy. It's on the similar footing as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It has the wide scope of protection for personal data relating to the home, the privacy, as well as correspondence. So that right is enshrined in our Constitution. When it comes to the GDPR, which is the European Union's regulation for data protection, it looks at the data that we hold that belongs to EU citizens. And so that regulation came through in 2018, which is sort of what triggered other nations into passing their own local laws to make sure that they are aligned and that the requirement is complied with for their nations. So following that, in 2019, Uganda passed our Data Protection and Privacy Act, which was followed by regulations in 2021. So this law went ahead to operationalize the right to privacy. So previously we had the article in the Constitution, but there was no clear framework or structure as well as an institution to enforce that right. But when the Data Privacy Act was passed, then the Data Privacy Office was opened, which is housed at NITA, and that has been a very helpful tool and also institution for enforcing the right to privacy. So we have more enforcement mechanisms as well as clear requirements as well as consequences set out in that act. So a high-level discussion of what the act provides. We have some key definitions under the Data Protection Act, which really delineate what data is as well as what information is. It also tells us who a data subject is, as well as the different categories of persons that are involved in handling personal data. So data is information that is processed, recorded, or which forms part of an accessible record. Then information is defined as well as a data or text or images or sounds, codes, databases stored in any format. So we are looking at a wide range of data. It could be a text message, it could be a photograph, it could be a name, an email address, it could be a sound, a recording, that is also data. And it could be personal as far as it is possibly information you can use to identify an individual. A data subject is that individual from whom you collect information. And so it's important to know who you collect information from. A data collector is the one who collects the data, and then the controller determines the purpose and manner in which data is processed. Then a data processor is defined as that person who processes the data on behalf of the controller. Bringing it close to us in our organizations, we have different teams and different offices that handle the different transactions that concern our business. So in this case, and also to look at it as the overall organizational structure, the organization will have to register with NITA as the overall controller, processor, and also collector, because you have employees, but then you're responsible for what they're using that information for or their roles in your data life cycle. So companies and other businesses have been registering as different categories depending on what transactions they actually go through in their business. So for example, because you collect employee data, as an employer, you have to register as a collector. But then also you're processing that information in order to comply with the law. So you have other agencies, for example, NSSF or the tax bodies where you are exchanging that information. To that extent, you are a controller because someone is processing data on your behalf. So it's important to know at what point of the chain you fall and what obligations apply to you. The Act goes ahead to define the rights of the data subjects, which include the right of access. This means that a data subject can walk in at any time and ask to access the information that they gave to you. So for example, if you have a former employee who has since departed from your organization, they have a right to come and ask you for the information they provided to you. So for as long as you have that information, they have a right to get it. So unless you have a lawful excuse, that right is something that you have to comply with. The other right is the right to erasure. A data subject can come and ask you to delete that information that you have, depending on what level of purpose that you have for that information. If they have a reason as to why you should no longer hold that information, they have a right to ask you to delete it. And unless you have a lawful reason not to comply, it's important that you go ahead and comply. The other rights related to data protection and data privacy are the right related to automation. Again, a data subject can come in to control what you do with their information for automatic decisions. For example, if you have data that you're using to assess your employees' performance or make decisions concerning termination or other disciplinary measures, it's important that you inform the employees, and they have a right to stop that processing, or at least to know why, the purpose for which you are using that information in automatic processing. Then the same right to object to processing applies to the same, what are you doing with my information at every point, and I have a right to object if you're using it for something that I do not approve of. For example, if I gave you information for purposes of health insurance, I do not expect you to use it for purposes of termination or using my health as a reason to terminate or any other unfair treatment. I will object to that processing for a purpose for which I did not provide that information. The other right is the right to rectification of inaccurate data. That's another right under the Act. So if there's any mistake, the data subject can come and ask you to correct it. The other right is the right to information. Data subjects can come and ask you for information that is not within their knowledge. For example, if you did not disclose the purposes for which you're collecting the data, a data subject can ask for that information and you have a duty to provide it. Then there's also a right to restrict processing for direct marketing. And this is something that we need to be mindful of in the workplace environment. If you have not disclosed the reason for which you are using data, and it turns out that you're actually using the data for marketing without the consent of employees, then that exposes you to potential breaches around that right. So an employee can come and say, stop using my images, for example, for marketing, if they have a reason to. But if you have a structure and you've informed the employees of why you have that information and the reason for which you are using it, for example, in publications, then that consent would suffice for you to use that information. Then under the Act also, we have specific obligations, which I have touched on earlier, but basically around consent. You have an obligation to seek consent from the data subjects before you collect the data, and that consent needs to be explicit. It needs to be expressed, it needs to be informed, and there shouldn't be any ambiguity in that consent. So along the channel of data collection, processing, dissemination, transfer, there needs to be clear consent from the data subject. Then regarding special personal data, this is data of a nature that identifies the data subject's personal, really sensitive data. For example, the health status of a data subject. If you have health information that is sensitive and special data, which the data subject can actually prohibit you or stop you from using at any point. So you have to have a really special reason for having that information. For example, if you are processing insurance for your employees, then their health information is important, and they need to know that as you collect that information. So as far as health information, financial information is concerned, the purpose needs to be clear. Then there's a prohibition on collection of data relating to children. So if you have information relating to children, there needs to be consent from the parent. And if you don't have that, then there's a potential breach of your obligations. The other obligation is to limit processing of personal data outside Uganda. So the Act restricts processing of data outside Uganda, particularly where that data is being transferred to countries where there are no similar controls on the privacy of that information. So at the time of registration, the Data Protection Office will assess the countries to which you disseminate or transfer information and will guide you in case of any potential risk to that information. Then there is also a right to adhering to the rights of data subjects, which you've mentioned. So if you have any reason not to comply with the right of a data subject, as you respond to that request from a data subject, you also have to send a copy to the Data Protection Office. So in that regard, you have an obligation for responses to the requests that data subjects will send through from time to time. Then deletion, the identification of data, as well as best practices, that's another obligation. So under the Act, people who collect data, organizations are supposed to make sure that that data is used for the purpose, and as and when it's not required, deletion is a mandate that every collector has, every processor has. If you no longer need that information, you have to delete it. If you need it for another reason, then de-identification can support you to maintain it, but also to have it de-identified so that you can use it without consequence. For example, you can anonymize your former employees and maintain just the details that maybe you may need for business decisions regarding human capital needs or requirements. Then the other obligation is to appoint a data protection officer, which is mandatory for every organization that collects or processes or manages or controls data. The data protection officer has duties that we shall discuss a little later, and that also is an obligation of data handlers or processors. The other obligation under the Act, which is material to note, is the data impact assessment, which is required whenever your processing of information has or poses a high risk to the freedoms of the persons of whose information you're processing. So as and when you collect information and have to process it, whenever you are processing it, you need to assess what is the impact of my processing. Is there any risk above the purpose for which I've collected it? So if there's a risk higher than the purpose, then probably you're going to change your mind about processing that data or enhance the controls for the protection of that data. So those are the obligations under the Act. So we'll dive into the gist of today's discussion, and which I hope is going to be an interactive session. Looking forward to those questions, comments, and contributions in the chat regarding the strategies for fostering a data privacy culture. As I mentioned earlier, we have very different organizations, and my culture may not be your culture. So you need to know your organization. You need to know what your operations look like. You need to know the kind of people that you relate with and whose data you hold. You need to know your employees and what exactly their roles are so that you can develop a bespoke or an effective strategy and data program which speaks to your operations. So as we discuss around the strategies, I am requesting that you think through the things that you do in your organization, the data that you hold, the people that you work with, the employees, and of course the chief data that we have, all of us as employers, as organizations, is the information that we hold for the employees that work with us. That's the primary, usually that's the primary information, data that we hold. So right from the employee information, customer information, third parties that we deal with, our suppliers, as well as the directors. Sometimes we forget even the founders of the organizations, directors' information. So the protection is holistic. And the strategy, the culture, the program needs to speak to the holistic information that we hold. So it's of course important that you document and review the strategy, the program that you have in place, as well as the environment in which you operate. For example, when we reverted to working from home because of the pandemic in 2020, many organizations had to relook at their strategies regarding data privacy and to make amendments to their existing policies. For example, when we introduced the work from home avenue in order to limit the movement and to manage the continuity of business, many organizations had to come up with a new policy around protection of data while you're working remotely. So things like that need to inform what you're doing. But most importantly, and I have picked out those three chief contributors to a culture of privacy. The first one is a tone from the top. What does senior management, what does the board display about data privacy and the importance of a good privacy culture? What is that image? What is the pace that is set from the top? I know I don't like to call it the top because at the end of the day, data privacy is it's for everybody in the organization, right from the reception to the last employee at the chain. Data protection is important. However, why I say tone from the top is very important and probably the most important aspect of developing a good privacy structure and a good privacy culture is because of that authority, the mandate, and also the level of control over what we do, the decisions that are made concerning personal data and what we do, the investment as well into systems, people, processes, as well as consequence management rests with and usually will be taken by the senior leadership, the board, as well as the even middle managers that control different decisions in the organization. So it's important that the leadership around data privacy is strong and that communication is heard right from the top. For example, when it comes to selecting a data privacy officer, it's encouraged that the person proposed or appointed to hold that office in the organization is someone with relative autonomy and also a high level of understanding of the organization, so that as they do their duty of corresponding with the data protection office, they're able to address the root cause as well as the holistic application of the data privacy in their organizations. So looking at the tone from the top, there's also a need to commit to the privacy program. So as the teams that you have in place implement their different roles in the chain, we shall look at the different teams a little later. It's important that the management, the senior management in the organization is aware of the different initiatives that are being conducted throughout the organization, as well as supporting the teams that they have. Then when it comes to messaging, it needs to be clear, it needs to be proactive, and it's always more authoritative from the top, from the senior management. So in organizational structures and also communication, it's important that the senior leaders in the organization are able to present the message of the organization in a way that sends the message both to the internal clients, but also the external clients, that it is important that privacy is treated with the respect it deserves within the organization. So you find that chief executive officers, senior teams, for example, the chief information officers, will take it upon themselves to be the ones to communicate and to send out messages to their staff about privacy in the organization. That is very important. So then, in addition to the tone from the top, it wouldn't make sense for the tone to be so good, but then there not being a program or a clear process through which data privacy is managed or protected. So when it comes to the data privacy program, it's important that it's one that communicates, as I mentioned, to the whole journey or ecosystem of your information. So information belonging to both external and internal stakeholders, like employees, needs to be handled. So the policies that you have in place need to be comprehensive. For example, if you have a policy around collection, it needs to have all the steps at which you collect information covered, so that you have sight of which teams are involved and which customers are affected. So then the procedures would also inform the whole ecosystem and the whole journey of the information that you have. The processes, systems, and technology are also important. As we see that adoption of technology and the movement at which we are going, with organizations now implementing, for example, automatic information collection, as well as adopting AI and other options for data analytics, and also for easing the processing of transactions as well as engagements. We've noticed that a lot of robotic as well as other technologies are being adopted. So those introduce new risks, and it's important that your program is looked at and adjusted to cater for those risks and to make sure that the teams that you have in place are aware of the risks and also take into action their steps as they manage or control those risks. Then when it comes to the people, you have the data protection officer and the support team that works with them. So again, as I mentioned, this team needs to be equipped and supported in their mandate. What does that mean? So you may need to consider training them and helping them to make sure that they have the right knowledge concerning data protection and privacy. Then the team that's supporting them as well should have the necessary tools. For example, if it's in the information technology office, it's important that they have the right tools and the things that they need to be able to implement their role as they work. Then the training as well, it's important that you have training for all the staff that you have in your organization. And that would also depend on what each employee does. So the training that you have needs to speak to the role of that employee in the data management cycle in your organization. For example, if you're training the reception, you have to reduce the training to that level of understanding from when a customer walks in to when they walk out. What are those things that concern how I interact with them, how I keep the records that I collect from them, how I inform them about the privacy handling in our organization. So passing on the message or the policy, the statement, the data privacy notices is something that you would train them on, as well as the ability to respond to questions that may be posed to them in their mandate as the front office. And the same thing goes for client-facing teams. They need to know what concerns them at that level so that they're able to address any questions within their work. Then when it comes to complaint and incident management processes, it's important that you have a clear structure as well as direction around where do I send my complaint. For example, if an employee is faced with a client's complaint about the misuse or abuse of their data, it's important that the employees that are contacted know what the next step is. Who is it that we submit a complaint to? And what is the incident management process? So that's something that you need to have very clearly detailed and have as part of your training program. Inform the staff, let them know who is in control of the information and who can handle the complaint management. For example, most organizations will have a team, incident management teams, that handle any incidents concerning data privacy breaches. So the purpose there would be for investigations to be conducted, as well as for responses to requests from data subjects will be managed in a central place and also tracked for future references. So again, the incidents that are collected or that are handled needs to be part of your training curriculum. So these lessons come through as you're training, then you're using them to reinforce your message and also to pass on new ways of protecting the organization. Then when it comes to accountability, I know that when it comes to culture, developing culture usually has a soft tone to it, and that's why I think today I'm keeping away from the sections of the law and quoting the technical aspects of the compliance. It's all about understanding what the role of each person is, as well as holding them accountable for their role. So as you develop the performance metrics, as you look at the job descriptions, as well as the transactional steps that your employees go through, you need to make sure that they have a data privacy component to them, and that it's very clear how they come in making sure that the organizational culture around privacy is protected. So that may entail, of course, performance reviews, which look into how the employee has handled the data that they are in charge of, as well as making sure that any mishaps are curbed in time. That can be done through regular audits, but also monitoring mechanisms. For example, as an employee is sending emails, it's possible, and it should be part of the process, for the tools that they use to be able to detect personal information that is going out and make sure that there is a valid reason or purpose for that information going out. So you could introduce blockages within the system to make sure that those are checked, and if there's a valid purpose, then the email can be sent through. So as you're monitoring performance around data privacy, it's also important that tools and controls are developed to make sure that the employees know exactly what their role is, but also what the tools they have at their disposal are. For example, when you come to working from home or working remotely, it's important that you emphasize, not even just working remotely, but even at the desk, it's important that you emphasize to the employees those different performance basic daily activities like changing passwords or locking your screen if you're walking away. Also, the use of virtual private networks. If you're working remotely, it's important that you protect access, prevent access to your information, and that you are using the right tools. So there, it's important that awareness is part of your daily activities, but also periodic audits to make sure that the employees are enforcing what the messages have been. When it comes to enforcement, I'm looking at information that's electronic, but also that is physical. So access to information, I need to know what information I need, and access to information needs to be on a need-to-know basis. For example, if you have a physical data storeroom, it's important that access is controlled, and that once someone enters that room, it's important to know why have they entered and what have they taken out. So that exposure to data and also how it is handled needs to be monitored. There's also a need to report. Reporting is very important when it comes to accountability. So your policies and your processes need to account for that. So it's both the internal reporting in case of incidents, but also reporting to the regulator. So as part of your organizational culture, it's important that reporting is encouraged and emphasized. Do not prohibit the culture of reporting, because it's central to knowing what has happened and what can be done to avoid it in the future. So again, the reporting needs to be within the structure. You don't report to just anyone. So the policy around reporting and incident management needs to be enforced in terms of who is reporting and to whom are they reporting, to avoid further breaches. So as and when an incident happens, it's good to have a clear channel and to encourage reporting. Do not treat the reporter with such disgrace that the next person who incurs or who has an incident is afraid to report. So encourage a culture of reporting and deal with those incidents as they come in a way that reinforces your understanding, but also the consequences come out in a way that you have considered and supported the staff in that process. Then another important thing to look at in terms of accountability is the surveys and feedback. It's possible to have policies and the very good program around privacy, but then if you're not checking its viability, if you're not checking its appropriateness by hearing from your staff, by hearing from your stakeholders, then you're probably going to have incidents where they are preventable losses, preventable abuses. So if there's a challenge around the system, for example, if the system is not robust, or if there are hurdles within the reporting mechanism, if the rights for reporting access or detail, if there are fields that are not functional, it's important that you have the feedback from the users and respond to that feedback. That will help you to clean up any challenges along the culture and the systems that you have in place. So again, it's important probably annually or quarterly to have those surveys around data privacy. How are we doing? How can we do better? And that can also be done in liaison with the third-party processors or IT providers, people that you work with, to make sure that it's a holistic view of how you're handling data. When it comes to developing a culture, it's very important that we know that it's not a one-man show, it's a collaborative effort, and so all teams in the organization need to work together to achieve that culture. So again, as I mentioned, it's good to have the board and management at the helm of data privacy culture development and enforcement. So you have the roles here on the different people and what they're supposed to do. I know I mentioned some of them along the way, but you'll see that the board and management will have that role around approving and overseeing implementation. Of course, policies and frameworks are only policies and frameworks, but they need to be implemented. So for example, if the IT department discovers a new threat to the organization's data privacy um, management and report that to the board needs to be able to look at it holistically, but also to consider the cost benefits of the cost and the benefit of the proposals around mitigation of that exposure and decide around what do we do, what do we invest, what do we change. It could require a change of systems and therefore a cost. And so the board and management need to be involved and also to take these reports and implement changes around the systems, the technologies, as well as the processes. Then the data protection officer, as I earlier mentioned, is in charge of that overall coordination of implementation of the data protection and privacy program. And they are supposed to work closely with the data protection office. So if you're a data protection officer, it's important that you have oversight of the whole organization. You know what the organization has with it in terms of personal data and what you are doing to protect the data, but also to make sure that if you don't need that data anymore, it is deleted at the right time. So data retention as well as usage is important, and the data protection officer has to coordinate all of that with the internal and external stakeholders, but also with the regulator. Then the legal risk and compliance team, I know that today I really wanted us to have a discussion around the softer side, but again, legal risk and compliance are charged with making sure that every document within the organization has an aspect to data protection. If it's contracts, they make sure that they review those contracts and make sure that there is no exposure. For example, around data protection and privacy, if you do not have controls within your contracts or policies and privacy notices, then there will be a breach and then you will not be able to recover. For example, if you have a contract with a vendor who in the contract mentions that they will need to access your systems in order to deliver their services. As a legal risk and compliance team, it's good that you look at that holistically and know what the third party's access to your systems will cost the organization or benefit the organization. And then put in their controls, for example, indemnity clauses or restrictions to the scope of access, depending on what the provider is going to need. For example, if you have a vendor coming in to provide laptops, if they ask you for access to the payroll system, you definitely know there's a problem there. And you know that they are bringing laptops. They don't need to access any other system. So at that point, remove such a clause and make sure that the clauses in the contract relate to the work that's going to be done. Then when it comes to the IT team, who are really in a place of sort of the backbone, in addition to the senior management, the IT, information security and technology teams play a critical role in making sure that the organization's culture is actually upheld. So if we have a good culture, but then our tools let us down, if our products do not have a design for data protection, then there will be a breach. So that IT team is charged with making sure that impact assessments are conducted holistically and that the tools that the organization uses are fit for the purpose, but also that they have controls in place. So that brings in the privacy by design and by default. So making sure that the organization's documentation, systems, processes all speak to the data that the organization holds, but also control access and also usage of that information. For example, when it comes to employees, if you're granted access to the system for purposes of your work, and then your department changes, for example, you're in finance, and now you're moved to, for example, HR, your access to finance information needs to be disabled at that point, and your access to HR given. So access controls by the system, by the systems department and the IT department needs to be agile and make sure that there is no exposure due to delays in controlling or changing access rights. So the same goes for former employees. Once an employee is out of the organization, the IT team, together with the HR team, should be able to stop access at that point. Then when it comes to procurement, managing third-party risk, procurement teams usually have that mandate to conduct a due diligence and to make sure that personal data that will be accessed by the third party is measured but also controlled in a way that protects the data. Then there's a need, of course, to have ongoing monitoring of the contractual obligations under those procurement contracts and making sure that the team that the service provider is working with is in constant communication with the procurement team in case of any changes to the need to access that information, and then the contracts would be amended. So you can see how the interplay between departments is important on an ongoing basis. Then when it comes to learning and development, that's the team that defines the structure and also curriculum for staff training and awareness. So that team is important because it determines the content, and that content needs to be informed by the organizational needs from time to time. Communications department, of course, would take charge of the messages and the management of privacy risk from a communications front. So it comes down to emails, posters, placements around the organization's activities. So again, communications needs to be very sensitive in the information that they disseminate. For example, if I'm sending out an email to invite our clients for a training, I should not include personal information, for example, email addresses of other clients, in a way that whoever is in that email can access. We need to be controlling what goes out in our communications, but also making sure that the communication around data privacy is very effective in terms of the messages, the roles, as well as the encouragement for a culture of privacy. Human resources, I mentioned earlier, they hold a lot of information around employees and also former employees, as well as people seeking jobs. So it's important that the human resources team is aware of the risk that they face or that they pose to the organization and make sure that that is controlled. Again, personal information in the human resource department needs to be accessed on a need-to-know basis. For example, the finance department will access human resources information only for the purpose of processing payroll, not beyond that. So if the finance department comes requesting the human resource department for information regarding the health status of an employee, that needs to be questioned in terms of why is the information necessary, and then that coordination needs to happen. Then the sales, marketing, the reception, client relationship managers, all of those are important in terms of frontline defense for privacy, as well as knowing what it means for the people walking in to our organizations and making sure that they're aware of the privacy statements and that the interaction is of a nature that communicates that their information is private, but also that there's a purpose for that collection. So communication at that collection level is important. So then when it comes to internal audits, I mentioned that regular or frequent audits are important in order to curb risks as they arise, as well as to identify new threats to the organization. So the internal audit team should ideally look at the control environment and test it from time to time to make sure that in case of any weak links, they are addressed in time. So the internal audit team, and that could take any form, depending on your organization. The IT team could take charge of the control assessment, or support from external auditors could support you to determine if your systems, your controls are effective. So in a nutshell, and some of the key takeaways which I've mentioned as I came along, we have an important need for training. Regular training is important, just to make sure that the staff are aware of the obligations they have at their level, but also organizational obligations, so that there's that understanding and also ownership around what is required and taking it seriously. Then in the process of onboarding and also applications for employment, it's important that the HR documents, whether it be contracts or the manual, the induction program, all of them should take into account privacy and emphasize it at that point, so that from the time of entering the organization, the staff know what privacy means to that organization and to the people that they'll interact with in the course of their employment. But also the employees themselves need to know that the human resources department will treat their information with that same respect and protection. So it all starts at home. If I know as an employee that my information is protected, I will most likely treat the next person's information with the same level of protection. So that whole organizational culture matters right from the first relationship, which is usually the onboarding team and the human resource team. Then when it comes to documentation, I mentioned the need to have a documented program, but also have the records, whether it's complaints or requests from data subjects. It's good to have all your documentation so that you know exactly what you hold, but also what you have done to control it. So things like the privacy statement, the privacy policies, data sharing agreements, all of that needs to be documented. Consent forms for the data subjects to complete from time to time, as well as recording data subject requests. All those need to be managed very well so that you can have seamless investigations or incident responses, but also effective reporting and decision making. Internal sanctions, I know culture can be hard to develop. It takes time, but yes, the carrot and the stick apply. It's important that you have sanctions for misuse of data, but also for different phases. You have sanctions depending on the breach. So if it's a malicious breach, for example, you could go to the extent of even criminal action against the employee that has taken that malicious action. So if there's outright data theft and it's proved, then the policies need to provide for those sanctions, and the staff need to be aware of them. Then, as I mentioned earlier, it's important that there are synergies within the organization and that departments are collaborating, communicating with each other, because the challenges you have in your department could be the challenges another department will have. So as we develop culture, it's good that we communicate and that we know exactly what is at stake for the organization, but also for ourselves, because there are also personal consequences like criminal action. So it's good that we communicate and that we help each other to build that culture that respects and protects data. So as I mentioned, privacy is a team sport. It's a team collaborative part of our businesses. Not one person can develop a culture alone. It's important that the whole team plays together and that the organization speaks with one voice, one tone concerning data privacy. I thank you for listening to me and look forward to your responses and contributions. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much, Hilda, for that very well structured and educative presentation. And of course, most especially for shedding light on the critical roles of the different teams. I hope for all of us that have attended today's webinar, we will be able to pass on these messages of the critical roles to our different teams. In fact, I think a training for your teams on key roles in relation to data protection and privacy would be essential. Now, we are going to move on to the questions. Hilda, we have about 2 questions so far in the Q&A panel. I am going to read them out and then allow you to respond to them. Someone says, thank you for the insightful presentation. I appreciate the valuable information you've shared. Now, the questions are: 1, how can organizations ensure that their approach to data privacy remains relevant and effective in light of evolving regulations and technological advancements? And the second question, would you like me to take the 2 at a go, or would you like to first answer one by one?
I think we can take one by one.
Okay. So we can have that.
All right, thank you for that question. It's actually important. And as I mentioned, the data protection environment, but also the kind of data that we are dealing with evolves, as well as the technologies that are developing. So for example, I mentioned AI. It's important to know that artificial intelligence actually comes with additional risk, which much as we benefit from the artificial intelligence, it's important that we are aware of the extended exposure to potential breaches and address them as and when they arise, but also to proactively avoid or prevent those risks. So how organizations can make sure that they stay relevant or updated in terms of their culture, but also the processes, policies, is by having that team that is charged with data protection and management informed. For example, I appreciate that the Data Protection Office of Uganda has been proactive in involving organizations in that assessment of training needs, for example, but also in terms of sharing information. Sharing of information is very important, as and when there are developments in different nations or organizations. For example, the international organizations regarding privacy professionals. There's a lot of information out there. So how you can stay relevant is by accessing this information, by being interested in what's happening elsewhere, because we'll find that regulations, but also cultures and best practices develop across the globe. So it's important to benchmark and to periodically check in with sister companies or third-party companies you deal with in different organizations you deal with. Keep comparing what's happening, and most likely you will find one or two things, developments that you did not know and you need to learn from. So it's good to keep yourselves informed. It's good to equip yourselves. For example, I mentioned artificial intelligence. Many of the teams that we have in place are new to information around the new technologies, the new digital developments. So upskilling, training on these technical fields is important. So if your information technology team does not have the relevant skills concerning data protection, it's important that you equip them with that training. So your training program needs to look at the gaps, but also your information and knowledge management teams need to look at what information do we need that we don't have. Then the sources of information are vast. So you're going to have, for example, the regulator will have information, but also other organizations. I know that we've relied a lot on the European Union data protection regime. So there's always more information coming through developments around privacy. So keep yourself informed, keep yourself upskilled, but also revise the documentation, revise the policies you have in place, and make sure that indeed, as you mentioned, you stay relevant and that your organization is agile when it comes to data protection and privacy. Yeah, I hope I've answered that question. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. There's another question which is also in relation to what you just answered. What future trends in emerging technologies do you foresee having the most significant impact on workplace data privacy? And what proactive steps should organizations take to prepare for these changes?
Okay. So as I mentioned, I think the two questions are quite related. And at the moment, we are faced with the technology developments, artificial intelligence, the machine learning, as well as the different tools that are coming up. So yes, proactivity is paramount, definitely. So when it comes to proactive steps, as I mentioned, upskilling is key. It's important that you know what the tools are. It's important that you know how to use them, and then develop guidelines for your staff on how to mitigate risks around those tools. So for example, if your team is using artificial intelligence for research, it's important that you know which sites or which tools are applicable to your business, but also assess the risk and also assess the impact on your staff by for purposes of making sure that if there's any adverse risk, the right communication is sent out to your clients, that we are using this for research purposes, and also making sure that if you're using artificial intelligence for research, you know what kind of information is going in there. For example, I would not expect a personal information or personal data to go through the research engines that you're using, that artificial intelligence. It's possible to research without disclosing personal information. So as much as possible, training on usage will be important as the different tools are rolled out. So I think it's all about awareness of the risk, but also knowledge on usage of the different technologies that are coming up. So the training that I mentioned needs to be of a nature that is forward-looking. You cannot train on just the desktop hard copy data protection regimes, but you have to look at the information technology shift, as well as the digital tools that you're using, and make sure that you're ahead. I mentioned benchmarking. It's important that you benchmark. If you have a network, for example, if your organization has offices in different countries, it's important that you know what's happening there, and learn from them and make sure that your teams are also as knowledgeable as they should be. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is around how can organizations restore trust after a data privacy incident?
Okay. So thank you for that question. So trust is developed, trust is earned, and as and when a breach happens, how you handle it will either further erode the trust or build it. So communication is important. And of course, even under the law, there's a need to communicate. If there's a breach or an exposure, the extent to which you communicate this to the data subject and also to the regulator is important. But it's also important to follow the guidelines in place around communication, so that the amount of information that each stakeholder needs may not be the same. So assess the different stakeholders in that incident and the timing within which to inform them. For example, if information to the regulator is within 48 hours, you want to get as much information as you need about the incident, and make sure that your notifications, your communications are holistic. So the internal incident management process needs to be very comprehensive and very timely. So if you have a timely response system, as well as a clear and transparent communication guideline, you should be able to manage the expectations of your stakeholders, but also the affected data subjects. So the explanation, the root cause analysis, as well as the mitigation measures that you communicate. For example, if personal data has leaked to the public, which was not supposed to go out, how fast do you retract it? How fast do you communicate to the stakeholders or the people that are involved in that disclosure? Whether it's a newspaper or a TV channel, how fast are you in corresponding to make sure that that data does not go further? So it's all about how you handle it. You can rebuild trust, especially if you demonstrate that you have the right controls and the breach was inadvertent, it was not malicious. So how you respond, how you explain to it, how you explain to the data subject is all important in rebuilding trust. But then also what mitigation measures and what's the future of your data handling culture? What's the future of such incidents? What are you going to do better? That all that information and plan and also the demonstration of interest and also respect for the data subject at that point will help you to rebuild trust. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. I'm going to take only two questions, and then we will have to close. One question is around how do we handle situations where management doesn't involve data protection officer insights in some of the contracts and agreements made that involve critical data exchanges? And then maybe you will allow me read the other last question as well. Someone asks what is considered as consent in a paperless environment. Over to you.
All right. Thank you for that. Again, I like the insights. Sometimes it sounds theoretical, but when you know that management is required to be interested and to drive the privacy culture, what happens if management is not responsive? What happens if the decision maker is not as interested in making changes? Maybe because of cost, or maybe because of potential additional risk. So it's good to evaluate management's position about a particular matter. If the refusal to include a clause or to take a particular action around data privacy is clear, then the response or what your next steps should be would be determined by that. So it's good to know and to put yourself in a position of understanding, but also of guiding management. Because if, for example, if you're the data protection officer and you're communicating a message or a proposal around data protection, a change that needs to be made, and they do not respond positively, it's possible that they didn't understand what the cost to the organization is. So it's important to communicate very clearly to management, but also to understand where they're coming from, close the gap of understanding. As I said earlier, it's important that everyone is aware of the business impact, but also of the potential risk that a particular step in the transactions poses. So I believe that with the better understanding and that collaboration, the communication, it's possible to shift management from opposition to proposition regarding your different initiatives as a privacy team, but also looking at support, potential support from the data protection office for guidance on different alternatives. So management could have a different view or different approach, and it's good to explore all options and incorporate the proposed changes as guided by the data protection office. So as I mentioned, we have different organizations, so it's possible that the delay or the hesitation is informed by probably your own organizational dynamics, which you need to understand and address, and also allow for that flexibility around your culture, your policies, and your compliance. Then what consent looks like in a paperless environment. I know we are all, most of us are migrating online, and many of the even government entities have gone online. So when it comes to consent in a digital space or paperless environment, it's important that as much information is available on the electronic sites, the websites, but also at every transaction step, it's important that you have as much information available. So consent has to do with awareness of the reasons, the purposes, but also the amount of data that you're collecting or processing. So on the digital tools that you have, do you have a link or a page for data protection awareness, but also for seeking that consent? So have a well-developed communication on the requirement for consent and have it in a place that it can't be missed. But also you could make it a key step before transacting, making sure that someone cannot proceed beyond probably the landing page on your website or your app before they have signed on or read your terms around data protection and privacy. So in that context, again, it's important for your IT teams, but also everyone involved in that chain around the digital services, make sure that they are aware of the points of collection, processing, but also to put in those consent clicks, consent information, the different forms in which you can get that consent. Involve the client, make sure it's visible, it's clear, they can't miss it, and they cannot go beyond your probably first page without reading and also clicking to confirm their consent. And that should be able to cover you regarding consent in the paperless business environment. I thank you.
All right, thank you very much for the questions around guidelines to draft procedures, those asking for trainings. Please reach out to the office and we'll be able to have a conversation. Our email for general inquiries is info@pdpo.go.ug. info@pdpo.go.ug. I will type it in the chat later so that you're able to pick it up from there. I have shared a link in the chat. Please kindly click on it and provide us feedback on today's webinar. The feedback you give us enables us to make the future webinars better for you. Okay, otherwise I'll allow me at this point thank our speaker for today. Hilda, thank you so much for today's presentation. It was very, very insightful and educative. We appreciate you for, of course, giving us your time. And of course, the practical strategies that you have shared today, we believe organizations will be able to use the same to move beyond compliance and make privacy a core part of their operations. And of course, to the participants, thank you so much for joining us and engaging in this important discussion. Let's continue the conversation and, of course, commit to building a stronger data privacy culture beyond today. Stay connected with us and share your thoughts. You can join us on Twitter. The hashtag is Data Privacy Month UG 2025. Please share your thoughts and we'll be able to continue the discussion with you. Otherwise, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, Hilda. Bye.
Bye-bye.